Our program tonight is on the sort of weird and dubious history that surrounds us in the form of plaques, statues, buildings, and other seemingly authoritative markers that one might naturally find in a historic town like Cambridge, Massachusetts. Our speaker tonight is Gavin Kleespies, my colleague. He is the Director of Programs, Exhibitions, and Community Partnerships at the Massachusetts Historical Society. Gavin has been in this role at the MHS for about 6 years, in which time he has significantly reimagined and expanded the public programs and exhibitions offerings at the MHS. He has spent 25 years working in public history, and his career to date has spanned 3 states and 5 organizations. Gavin was formerly the executive director of the Mount Prospect Historical Society in Mount Prospect, Illinois. And before coming to MHS, he was the executive director of the Cambridge Historical Society for 6 years. He also serves as a commissioner for the Massachusetts Historical Commission and the Cambridge Historical Commission. Gavin resides in, guess where? Cambridge, where he also grew up. He started his career in public history at the age of 13, giving tours of his home city. So, continuing the tradition, Gavin, take it away.
This tour started where I think all great adventures should start, which is with Leif Erikson. For anyone who might not know who Leif Erikson is, he was a larger-than-life Viking explorer who lived at the end of the 10th century and into the beginning of the 11th century CE. Leif was the son of Eric the Red and was legendary for his exploits and explorations. 7 or 8 years ago, while I was working for the Cambridge Historical Society, I heard that there was a marker in Cambridge that denoted the site of Leif Erikson's house. And I thought, I have to find this. So I started looking. I had a pretty good idea. I knew where it was going to be. There is a large white rock that sits just about where Mount Auburn Street and Fresh Pond Parkway meet Memorial Drive. It's clearly out of place. It looks like the kind of rock that you would put a big plaque on. It seems like a sort of monumental statement. So I thought that is inevitably going to be where this plaque is. But it's in a quirky intersection where you don't often find yourself walking, so I had to sort of make a point to go out of my way to find it. So I eventually did get there, and I found out that not only does this rock not have a plaque on it, it actually isn't a rock. It's a fiberglass cover for some kind of a utility thing. So lo and behold, this was not the site of Leif Erikson's marker. But this got me thinking about things that aren't exactly what they appear to be. And I started taking notes and paying attention and thinking about these things. And this eventually led to beginning an actual walking tour. This originated as a walking tour. It was meant to be something that sites that you could walk to in a reasonable amount of time, in about an hour, a little bit over an hour. So this tour is not a definitive list of misleading things in Cambridge, misleading things in Greater Boston. It is things that are funny or quizzical or misleading that are within walking distance of the actual plaque that denotes the site of Leif Erikson's home. So I did begin to dig into this story, and soon after exploring it more, I learned that all roads eventually lead to Eben Norton Horsford. Who was Eben Norton Horsford, you may be asking? He was born in 1818 in northwestern New York to a missionary father and a well-read mother. He was educated at the Rensselaer Institute of Troy, which today is called the Rensselaer Polytechnic Institute. In 1844, he traveled to Germany and studied chemistry, and upon his return to the United States, was able to secure an appointment as the Rumsford Professor at Harvard University. He was a pretty successful professor, concentrating mostly on the chemistry of food. He published a number of papers and received about 30 patents during his lifetime. And in 1856, probably the most notable of his patents is that he received a patent for baking powder, which is why you all actually know him today. If you go to the grocery store, you will see Rumsford baking powder. It is one of the more popular baking powders available, and it is named for his position as the Rumsford Professor at Harvard. Prior to his obsession with Viking, he was a highly recognized citizen. He was elected to the American Academy of Arts and Sciences and was famous for having developed Horsford Horsford's acid phosphate, which was described as an agreeable preparation of the phosphates for indigestion, nervousness, mental and physical exhaustion. He donated large amounts of this to the Union Army for the care of soldiers, and was generally a successful businessman and inventor. But at the end of his life, he spent his fortune, his social capital, and his intellectual legacy to support the idea that Vikings not only sailed to North America, but specifically to Cambridge and the surrounding towns. And the thing is that once you start looking for Vikings and Viking monuments in the Boston area, you realize that there's actually a lot of them. So pictured here, we have a selection. It includes the statue of Leif Erikson on Commonwealth Ave in Boston. This was actually paid for by Eben Norton Horsford. The Longfellow Bridge that connects Boston to Cambridge. If you look closely, you'll notice that there are the prows of Viking ships. The four main supports of the bridge, which have prows of Viking ships on them. The entrance to Building 5 at MIT also has a Viking ship above the door. The Weld Boathouse at Harvard has the prow of a Viking ship protruding from its entryway. And of course, there is the Norumbega Tower in Weston that marks the site of a lost Viking settlement called Norumbega. This was also paid for by Eben Norton Horsford. There was also an amusement park in Newton called Norumbega Park that was opened in 1897 and ran until 1963. And there are a number of place names that are notable. Part of Wellesley College sits on top of Norumbega Hill. It's also worth noting that Eben Norton Horsford, other than being obsessed with Vikings, was also a very strong proponent of women's education. And he actually donated quite a bit of money to Wellesley. So he's not just obsessed with Vikings, but was also a fan of women's education. But there's Norumbega Street in Cambridge, Norumbega Road in Weston, Norumbega Terrace in Waltham, and Norumbega Court in Newton. So this eventually brings us to the site of Leif Erikson's home in Cambridge. I did eventually find the marker, but it turns out that the marker is a little bit less impressive than what I had anticipated. Here's a close-up of the marker, which it says, on this spot in the year 1000, Leif Erikson built his house in Vineland. The marker was actually placed in 1893. And in my looking for this, I imagined it was going to be something quite a bit more monumental. There was going to be, a little bit more fanfare about this. I would imagine that most people walking along Memorial Drive walk past this and never notice it. And those that do probably don't pay much attention to it because it seems quite small and insignificant. So as I dug into the history of this marker, I realized that part of the problem is that the marker is in the wrong place. The marker, when it was placed in 1893, actually sat about 1,000 feet from where it stands today in the middle of this intersection. In 1964, however, the Commonwealth of Massachusetts extended Memorial Drive and originally just planned to tear up the marker and dispose of it. Thanks to the hard work of the fledgling Cambridge Historical Commission, the marker was saved and it was moved close to its original location, but not quite. So it is now, of course, a marker that says the wrong thing and is in the wrong place. If we look at this image from the Cambridge Tribune in 1924, you can get a sense of what the site looked like in its original state. So it was originally surrounded by a wrought iron fence that was supposed to denote the footprint of Leif Erikson's house with the marker just inside. Certainly a more formidable structure and a more formidable presence in the space. So I can get into a little bit more about why there is this obsession with Leif Erikson, but first I want to go on a couple short caveats. And just for the record, I am a little obsessed with Leif Erikson, so this first stop is going to be a little bit longer than the rest. But once we're done with Leif Erikson, we'll move along relatively quickly. So my first caveat is that while Eben Norton Horsford may have been the most prolific proponent of a story of Leif Erikson coming to Cambridge, he was certainly not alone. As early as 1837, there was a Danish scholar named Carl Christian Raft who suggested that Vikings sailed to New England. In 1841, Henry Wadsworth Longfellow, pictured to the left, published a poem, The Skeleton in Armor, which described a skeleton that had been unearthed in Fall River in 1832 and was found buried with artifacts including a metal chest plate. Although most people at the time believed that this skeleton was a Native American warrior, Longfellow wrote the poem describing it as a Viking. And this fueled a lot of speculation about the story that had been published by Raft and just these myths. So this was sort of floating in the air. Then in 1877, Ole Bull, who is pictured in the center here, and Ole Bull, you may not know who he is. Ole Bull was a Norwegian violin prodigy, which is a phrase you don't get to use all that often. He was considered like supernaturally charismatic and was quite the showman. He began in 1877 advocating for a statue of Leif Erikson in Boston. He traveled the world entertaining nobility and doing all sorts of amazing performances, such as for one of his birthdays, he actually performed on top of one of the pyramids in Egypt. But he made Cambridge one of his homes. So he would, when he wasn't traveling, would come back to Cambridge and was very much a member of high society in Cambridge. After his death, his widow, who was Sarah Chapman Thorpe Bull, who is the person all the way to the right, continued advocating for a statue to Leif Erikson in Boston. And she, after the death of Ole Bull, was relatively young. There was a large age difference between them, was very, very wealthy, and thanks to some very well-placed marriages, was connected to all the right families in literary Cambridge and Boston, and was certainly at the height of the social network. So these people advocating for monuments to Leif Erikson and or supporting the idea of Leif Erikson coming to New England certainly supported part of what Eben Norton Horsford was saying. My second caveat is to say that it is not at all crazy to believe that Leif Erikson made it to North America. In the 1960s, archaeological evidence of Viking settlements was discovered in the northernmost tip of Newfoundland and Canada. Since then, there have been other discoveries of additional sites, some of which were significantly inland from the original sites. So there is certainly evidence that Vikings came to North America. That said, all of these discoveries are about 1,000 miles north of Cambridge. And these archaeological discoveries were made in the 1960s and more recently. So at best, 70 years after the marker for Leif Erikson's home was placed in Cambridge. So this raises the question of what drove Eben Norton Horsford to be so obsessed with this that he spent huge amounts of his own money, self-published countless books, engaged in sort of a ongoing back and forth with other historians that was often heated and quite contentious. And why was this so meaningful to him? Why did it mean so much? I would go out on a limb and I would say that a part of this has to do with the changing demographics in Cambridge and Boston. So this was, of course, a reaction to the idea that Christopher Columbus had discovered America. So the idea that a Southern European, an Italian flying under a Spanish flag had discovered America was much more problematic once you started seeing this huge influx of Northern European immigrants into Boston and Cambridge. And you can see from these graphs that around the time that a lot of this fervor springs up, there is a huge uptick in the immigration of Southern European immigrants. So I think that, it's very reasonable to say that some degree of the desire to have a Norse discoverer of New England is tied up in a anti-immigrant sentiment or a nativist sentiment at the end of the 19th century. Now, I've certainly rambled on about Leif Erikson for far too long, and since this was originally a walking tour, I would say that the cardinal rule of walking tours is that you should never stay in one place for too long because people's feet get sore and they begin to get kind of cranky. So I think we should move on to the next site, which is just about 2 blocks away. So if we walked from the site of the marker of Leif Erikson's home and actually walked past the big white rock that isn't actually a big white rock, we would end up in front of Elmwood. Elmwood is a fabulous house. It has a long and complicated history. It was built in 1767 for Thomas Oliver, who eventually went on to become the lieutenant governor of the colony. Originally included an estate of about 98 acres and is one of the 7 Tory row mansions in Cambridge. The designation Tory row mansions refers to houses that were built to house a population that started coming into Cambridge at the end of the 18th century. This population was very wealthy. They were Anglican, which was different than the Puritan founders of Cambridge and the general population. They were members of the Tory political party, and they remained loyal to the crown as the American Revolution approached. So they were a little bit of outsiders in the community, and they built houses that were considered lavish by the standards of Cambridge at the time. Thomas Oliver, like many of the other Tory row families, had actually most of his wealth came from sugar plantations in the Caribbean, which were some of the most brutal examples of the institution of slavery. He was connected by marriage and by social friendship to all the other Tory row families in Cambridge and many of the prominent families, many of the prominent Tory families in the region. This meant that he had a lot of political connections, and through that went on to become a judge of probate and eventually was appointed to be lieutenant governor in 1774 by General John Gage. His time in Cambridge came to a relatively abrupt halt following an event called the Powder Alarm, which happened on September 2nd of 1774. This is actually a great event leading up to the American Revolution. I could go into it at great length, but I will spare you that. The Powder Alarm essentially culminated with about 4,000 protesters carrying sticks, marching from the Cambridge Common down Tory Row and surrounding Lieutenant Governor Oliver's house, demanding his resignation. To contextualize this, 4,000 people sounds like a lot, and it really was. That at the time, the population, the entire population of Cambridge was around 2,000. So this is as if everyone in your town and then twice as many people join them to protest and surround your house. Lieutenant Governor Oliver wisely did not come out to address the crowds, but rather sent a servant out with a letter that said, "My house in Cambridge being surrounded by about 4,000 people, in compliance with their commands, I sign my name," and resigned. Shortly thereafter, Lieutenant Governor Oliver left Cambridge, as did all of the other 6 Tory row families and many of the other people who were loyal to the crown, just feeling that Cambridge was less safe than Boston. Many of them moved into Boston, which was the capital of the colonial government, and had a much larger military presence. Some moved further afield, but they dispersed from their houses in Cambridge shortly after the Powder Alarm. This house later was taken over by the Massachusetts Committee for Safety, and it's noteworthy that in 1775, Benedict Arnold and his men made it their headquarters for a short period of time. After the American Revolution, it was sold to Elbridge Gerry, who was the governor of Massachusetts. He later went on to serve in Congress and to be the vice president under James Madison. He is, of course, best known for the term gerrymandering, which is the redistricting of voting districts to favor yourself. But one way or the other, he lived here as well. In 1818, it was sold to Charles Russell Lowell and was the birthplace of James Russell Lowell, the poet, essayist, and first editor of the Atlantic Monthly. Eventually, in 1961, it was donated to Harvard and has been the home of the president of Harvard since 1971. So, fantastic house, nothing historically misleading about it. Why are we here? So we're here because if you walk down the street, you can also visit Elmwood at 22 Fairweather Street. So this is the first of mimic houses that we'll visit. So this house on Fairweather Street was built in 1898, designed by architect H.D. Hall, and is meant to be a replica of Elmwood. This is somewhat fascinating that if you are going to pay to build a house and to hire an architect, that you would choose to build a house that was most famous for having been surrounded by 4,000 angry people with sticks who wanted you to resign, as well as the connection to Benedict Arnold, is just sort of a questionable choice of a house to build a replica of. Nonetheless, it's just sort of interesting to know that there are houses in Cambridge which are replicas of other houses in Cambridge. So moving down onto Brattle Street, this is also a fantastic house. This is the Hooper-Lee-Nichols house at 159 Brattle Street. It is the headquarters of the Cambridge Historical Society, where I worked for 6 years. It is one of the 7 Tory mansions, but it is a little bit more complicated than the others in that it was not specifically built for one of the Tory families. It was rather adapted. An existing building was adapted for a Tory family that moved into it, the family of Judge Joseph Lee. But what's particularly interesting about the house is it's actually the 2nd oldest house in Cambridge. The original core of it, which if you can see my mouse moving around, the original core was these 2 rooms, one on the 1st floor and one on the 2nd floor. And those 2 rooms date to about 1685, or is believed to date to 1685. The house grew over the years with numerous additions and then modifications, and then it went through a process of being Georgianized. And then probably the last major change to it was that in 1916, the preservation architect, Joseph Chandler, came in and tore the back of the building off and rebuilt it in a colonial revival structure. So it's a building that contains 17th century elements, 18th century elements, as well as 20th century elements. There is an actual reason why we're stopping here on the Misled tour, but there's also sort of an amusing thing that I came across while I was researching this tour back in the day. And at the time I was just going through some files at the Historical Society, the Cambridge Historical Society, and I came across a letter that was dated March 11th, 1993, and was written to Wendell Garrett, who at the time was the resident fellow living in the building. Wendell Garrett was an interesting person. He had a PhD in history and was really the first person to really push the interpretation of the house into a much more professional standard. But the letter was quite indignant, and the letter included the statement, if you will paw through the papers on your desk, you might find my lengthy report of several years ago correcting the many errors of fact by Sterling Dow. As an aside, Sterling Dow was the first resident fellow at the Hooper-Lee-Nichols house when the Cambridge Historical Society took it over. He was a Harvard professor of classics. Mr. Dow seems to have based his tour in part on what he was told by a grudge-ridden former chauffeur. My facts were based on documents in the Peabody Essex Museum archives and on my own personal experience while living there. I had never heard of your Mr. Chandler until you mentioned him in your talk on the house. I would like to suggest that the 2 family rose jars would show far better advantage if they were placed in the so-called Chandler room, which was originally a stable, hence the brick floor. One of the facts of interest not mentioned is that 159 was an important station on the Underground Railroad. So the room that this person is referring to is this room, which is the Chandler room. It's named for Joseph Chandler, the preservation architect who tore the back of the building off and rebuilt it in 1916. I just love the letter because it's so indignant and so sure of what the person is saying, which is completely wrong. Like, you can look at before and after photos. You can see that the house originally had a different back and that it was torn off and rebuilt. And if that wasn't enough, Joseph Chandler actually wrote an article about the renovation of the building, which was published in the 1922 edition of House Beautiful, where he outlines how he tore the back of the building off and rebuilt it and built this sunken floor with the bricks, and he built this sort of neo-colonial hearth. There's no fact at all to that letter. But the person was so angry about it and so sure of themselves that it was really quite amusing. It's also, there's no evidence that this house was ever a site on the Underground Railroad. And it was just sort of charming how that was sort of thrown off at the end, like, oh, and by the way, this was an important site on the Underground Railroad. And it's like, no, it wasn't. But anyways, that was just something that I thought was an amusing thing to highlight, that sometimes people who are very sure of their history aren't necessarily right. But now to move on to why we are actually here. we're actually at the Hooper-Lee-Nichols house because you can also visit the Hooper-Lee-Nichols house at 146 Brattle Street. So there is another mimic house, which is 146 Brattle. This was built in 1939. It has all the trappings of a Georgianized first period house, including the large center chimney and all of the Georgian details that were later added. It was designed by the firm of Duguid and Martin, which was a husband and wife architectural team made up of William Duguid and Mary Elkington Duguid, who specialized in small, high-quality period houses. It's also worth noting, if you're familiar with Cambridge, that they designed a number, I think actually all the colonial revival houses on Old B Road. So just kind of interesting to see that there are two mimic houses that are both within a few blocks of the original house. Just around the corner from the Hooper-Lee-Nichols house is 7 Lowell Street, which is a beautiful house that does not have any markers or anything that indicates that it is incorrect. The reason that it's worth stopping here is just because of one of its earlier residents. One of the earlier residents was actually Edward Bernays, who lived here, who purchased the house in the 1960s and lived in the building until he died at the ripe old age of 102. The building was originally built in 1850 for Moses Maynard Rice and designed by Isaac Melvin and Isaac Young. So who was Edward Bernays? Edward Bernays, among other things, was a nephew of Sigmund Freud. He was actually a double nephew of Sigmund Freud, which is a little unusual, but his mother was Sigmund Freud's sister, Anna, and his father was Elie Bernays, who is the brother of Freud's wife, Martha Bernays. So he was sort of like a double nephew of Freud. He moved to New York City in 1892 and became a driving force in advertising and marketing. He is considered the father of public relations. So he's sort of worth stopping and talking about on a tour called Misled, because his entire career was arguably misleading people. He is famous for a couple things. One was that he hugely increased the number of women smokers by highlighting cigarettes as sort of a road to independence. He branded them torches of freedom, and was hugely successful in increasing cigarette sales to women. He was also very notable in the United Fruit Company's sort of smoothing the waters following the 1954 overthrow of the democratically elected government of Guatemala, which is in part where the term banana republic comes from. And he lived most of his life in New York. Most of his professional life was in New York. He moved to Cambridge after he retired. And in Cambridge, he has the unusual distinction of being very involved in a very early political action of Cambridge citizens. And this action was to block the expansion of Memorial Drive, or the making Memorial Drive into a road that was much faster, much more like Storrow Drive with underpasses. When that movement was sort of underway, it was a very early grassroots organizing effort. It becomes a linchpin for many later organizing efforts in Cambridge, where many people reference the battle over the expansion of Memorial Drive. And the phrase that Bernays comes up with is "save the sycamores." And this was, Memorial Drive is lined with beautiful trees. And the idea was, if they dug underpasses such as Storrow Drive has, they would have to cut down these gigantic trees that line Memorial Drive. So the rallying call, "Save the Sycamores," was developed. And from opposition to the inner belt, to rent control efforts, to opposition to the Simplex redevelopment, many grassroots organizing efforts in Cambridge reference the Save the Sycamores. It becomes this sort of moment where the community gathers together and blocks a development that they don't like, and that phrase becomes really significant. However, it was pointed out in an article dated November 23rd, 1964 in the Harvard Crimson that the trees were in fact not actually sycamores, but plane trees, which are very similar to sycamore trees, but not actually sycamore trees. I guess Edward Bernays did continue to mislead people in Cambridge, and it's at least worth pointing out, even though this had nothing to do specifically with his house. So moving right along, this is 149 Brattle Street, so moving back onto Brattle Street. It is the Lechmere-Sewall house. It is also one of the 7 Tory mansions. It also has a fabulously long history. It was built in 1761 for Richard Lechmere. During the American Revolution, Baron Riedesel, with his troops who had been captured and were prisoners of war. The Baron was actually housed in this house and was famous for, while being a prisoner of war, as throwing dinner parties and being sort of a center. He was a charismatic European general, so he sort of brought excitement and flavor to Massachusetts and to Cambridge. So he was really sort of an interesting person during the American Revolution, while much of the Cambridge economy was actually very depressed because of the Revolution. So what's the reason for stopping here and talking about this house? Great house, great history. The problem with the house is that it isn't exactly what it appears to be. The house was actually raised up 1 story and a new first floor was built in 1869. Then later owners decided that they didn't like such a large house. So they picked it up and they moved it from its original location in 1886, and they tore the top floor off and rebuilt a smaller top floor. So it is a colonial house. It was one of the 7 Tory mansions, but only the 2nd floor is original, and it used to be the 1st floor, and it used to be across the street. So just a quizzical little house. Moving right along, this is 105 Brattle Street, which is popularly known as the Longfellow House, or actually factually known as the Longfellow House in Washington's headquarters National Historic Site. It is an amazing house. If you haven't had the chance to visit it, I would highly recommend it. It has been described as the best house museum in America. It's a wonderful site to visit. The building itself was actually built in 1759 and was built for John Vassall. The original property had about 87 acres, ran from Observatory Hill all the way down to the Charles River. All the 7 Tory mansions had estates that ran down to the Charles River. They all had unobstructed views of the Charles River and really sort of sat in this sort of bucolic settings. John Vassall was an important member of the Tory community. He and his wife, Penelope Oliver Vassall, fled following the powder alarm of 1774, and their property was seized. After Washington came to Cambridge to take control of the Continental Army, he used this house as his headquarters. He entertained Benjamin Franklin in the house. He also entertained Benedict Arnold in his house. And it was the center of the Continental Army's activities while they were encamped in Cambridge during the siege of Boston. After the American Revolution, it was purchased by a man named Andrew Craigie. Andrew Craigie is a fascinating person. He, at a very young age, at the age of 21, was actually hired in 1775 at the age of 21, was hired to be the apothecary for the Continental Army during the Revolutionary War. 2 years later, he became the nation's first apothecary general, a post which he held on to until 1783. When he left the army, he moved to New York and was involved in the wholesale purchasing and selling of medicines. He then relocated to Cambridge after making quite a bit of money in New York, purchased this house, and eventually went on to expand the estates to be close to 140 acres, including 2 of the other Tory mansions. He was hugely involved in the development of Cambridge, and if you look at a map of Cambridge today, the markings of Andrew Craigie are evident if you know where to look. Craigie built what was called the Craigie Bridge, also known as the Middlesex Canal Bridge, in 1809. This was a competitor to the West Boston Bridge, which had opened in 1793. Both of these were really important in terms of offering more direct routes from Cambridge into Boston. But the two firms competed fiercely against each other for traffic. Both of the bridges were built as for-profit enterprises, but a lot of the money that was meant to be made from these bridges was intended to be made by real estate speculation in the property around the bridges, with the idea that if you drive traffic to these bridges, people will have to come through your building, and as they come through your building or through your bridge, the property around it will be valuable. Andrew Craigie, quite important. If you look at the race between the Craigie Bridge and the West Boston Bridge, and you look at the roads that they built, you'll see that actually many of the primary roads in Cambridge are driven towards connecting traffic to those two bridges. Many people say that, you know, Cambridge has this crazy street layout because were old cow paths. Actually, that's not really that true. Most of the streets are driven by these for-profit businesses which are trying to drive traffic towards their bridges. So some of these streets include things like Prospect Street, Main Street, Cambridge Street, River Street, Western Ave, Concord Ave, Mount Auburn Street. All these streets are actually oriented towards driving traffic towards one or the other of these bridges. So Craigie ends up having a huge impact on the development of Cambridge. However, he was a pretty wild speculator, and he ended up living beyond his means and speculating beyond what he could support. And in the end, died bankrupt. And quite sadly, he died essentially living as a hermit holed up in this house, unable to answer the door for fear of meeting creditors. And after his death, his wife ends up renting out rooms in the house to boarders. So she essentially runs the house as a boarding house. One of the people who happens to be a boarder is a relatively young man named Henry Wadsworth Longfellow. Henry Wadsworth Longfellow goes on to become a famous poet. He marries into the Appleton family, and Nathan Appleton buys the house for his daughter and Henry Wadsworth Longfellow as a wedding gift. The house becomes a center of culture in Cambridge and New England. And eventually, following Longfellow's death, passes on with a series of deeds of property, essentially to become more public spaces, originally as the Longfellow Memorial Association, and eventually coming over to become part of the National Park Service. The question is, why are we here? This is a fabulous house. It has a fabulous history. Why are we stopping here? And the reason we're stopping here is actually for the park across the street from it. As I mentioned, all of the 7 Tory row mansions originally had unobstructed views of the Charles River. And as this estate is passing on following Longfellow's death, there is the stipulation that the park in front of it, which is today called Longfellow Park, should remain open with an unobstructed view of the Charles River. It was the last of the Tory row mansions to still have that view. And the thought was that it was important to preserve this, example of what the Tory row mansions were like. So the park was laid out in 1887 with the stipulation that nothing obstruct the view. The original design was by Charles Eliot, and it was donated to the city of Cambridge with the stipulation that the view could not be compromised. However, if you look here, you'll notice that you can't really clearly see the Charles River. And the reason you can't see the Charles River is because there's a monument to Longfellow that obstructs the view of the Charles River. So this was a later addition, and completely stops the ability of a person to stand on the front steps of the Longfellow house and see the Charles River. So that didn't work out as it was intended. Beyond that, just as an aside, the bust of Longfellow in the center, this bust was frequently stolen by young students who are pulling pranks. And eventually the city of Cambridge got tired of chasing down their their bust, and they replaced the original with a fiberglass mold. So this bust is actually a fiberglass copy of the original, and the original is inside the Cambridge Public Library. So not only does the monument to Longfellow obstruct the view of the Charles River, but it isn't even the original bust anymore. So it's not really what was intended. So moving right along, we can move down the street to 92 Brattle Street. 92 Brattle Street's a fabulous house. It was built in 1881 for Sally and Emma Carey. The thing that I find quite amazing about this house and misleading about this house is the plaque. I have no doubt that what the plaque says is accurate. It seems perfectly reasonable. And the plaque seems to be quite right. The trick about the plaque is that it is different from all the other blue oval plaques in Cambridge. Throughout Cambridge, there's over 100 blue oval plaques that look like the one in the upper left corner. These plaques were placed by the Cambridge Historical Commission throughout the city. They began marking sites of historical significance in 1976, and they have continued to, although many of them were placed in and around the time of the bicentennial. This one, you'll notice, is slightly lighter blue and does not have the Historical Commission seal, which is what you see in the top there. So again, I'm sure the facts on it are correct, but it just isn't a Historical Commission marker. If there's 100 blue ovals in a city, it's kind of amusing that somebody would choose to put up their own blue oval that just is a little bit different than the others. So, you know, more power to them. So now we're going to move on. This is in the Cambridge Commons, so it's a short walk down Mason Street from 92 Brattle Street. And we can see the tree surrounded by a fence. And if we were going to go up to it, you would see this stone marker next to it, which says, under this tree, Washington first took command of the American Army, July 3rd, 1775. If we go back, we can see it is a grand tree, truly a glorious tree. I believe it is an elm tree, but it is hard to believe that this tree actually dates to 1775. So the question is, what's going on with that? So the story of the Washington elm is that it is not that tree. The original Washington elm, as depicted in this plaque, also right next to the Washington elm, supposedly was where Washington took control of the Continental Army. I think there's lots of disagreements about whether that actually happened or not. Regardless, the tree was not actually where the tree is today. But the tree was in the middle of the intersection of Garden and Mason Streets, which is about maybe 1,000 feet from where the tree is today. And you'll see in this postcard that it was a huge tree. This was actually towards the end of the life of the tree. And it had the stone marker and the wrought iron fence that surrounded it, very much like the tree that we see today. However, the original Washington elm tree fell in 1924. Turns out that having a road built around it, a tree, is probably not the best thing you can do for the tree. So the tree eventually just got more and more sickly and eventually fell. Over the years of the tree becoming more and more sickly and being pruned, pieces of it were cut up and sent off essentially as relics all over the country. And by the time it actually collapsed, cross-section of the tree were cut and they were sent to the state houses in all the contiguous 48 states, as well as the White House and the Capitol building in Washington, D.C. And still today at auctions and things, you'll see candlesticks and different items that come up that claim to be made from the Washington elm. So it's one of these trees that there's just many, many, many pieces of in many different forms all around the world at this point. So the actual marker for the actual tree is in the middle of this intersection here. You can see this thing that looks like a manhole cover. That actually is a brass plaque, which does denote the site of the original Washington elm. So the stone marker, although carved in stone, is not very true, as that is not actually where the Washington elm stood. The tree that is surrounded by the the fence today is a sapling taken from the original Washington elm. So it's genetically related to the original Washington elm. It just isn't the original Washington elm. Also on the Cambridge Common has a whole series of complications. There is the Soldiers' Monument. The Soldiers' Monument is actually a wonderful monument. It was dedicated on July 13th of 1870 and designed by Darius and Cyrus Cobb. And Darius and Cyrus Cobb were identical twins. They were supposedly so identical that even their family members couldn't tell them apart. So whenever a photo was taken of them, one of them would put his hand inside of his jacket so that they would denote which one was which. Unfortunately, at some point, everyone in the family forgot which one put his hand in his jacket and which one didn't, so they still don't know which one is which. But the monument has somewhat of a complicated history. The Cobb twins were soldiers who had fought in the Civil War. That certainly helped their submission to the competition to design the monument. They enlisted on August 12th of 1862 and mustered out on June 18th of 1863 from Company F of the 44th Mass Infantry. And their role as veterans was certainly part of the reason that they won the commission. However, the commission ended up being intensely political, and there were there were 22 different artists who submitted proposals, and a few of them, or particularly one of them, became very upset that he did not win the competition and launched a major legal campaign against this. This actually went on for many years, and the legal battle included the city of Cambridge being sued by a Mr. U. Tracy Howe, who sued the city, saying that the charter for Cambridge Common required that it be an unenclosed space that was used as a training ground for the military, and that building a monument in the middle of it would make that impossible. And therefore, if the monument was constructed, the title to the Cambridge Common should revert back to the original proprietors and their descendants. This was eventually thrown out, but it was a fierce legal battle over the construction of the monument. There are also two other things that are worth pointing out about the monument that are kind of funny. One is that the soldier who stands on top, this soldier has caused a number of issues of consternation. It was noted that he is wearing a winter coat, but does not have a hat on. And that meant that he was actually out of uniform because he shouldn't have been wearing his winter coat if he wasn't wearing a hat. And this was actually written about by the early female American architect, Lois Lily Howe, who wrote in volume 33 of the Cambridge Historical Society's Proceedings. This caused a great deal of criticism, as soldiers are supposed to always wear their hats. One morning, the citizens awoke to find the soldier had a hat put on it in the night. It took the Cambridge Fire Department a whole day to get it off. So that little bit of the monument is a little amusing. It's also worth noting that in the original design, in the center of the monument, where today there's a statue of Abraham Lincoln, the original design did not include that. The original design was actually to have a sculpture of a dying Union soldier laying prostrate in the arms of another soldier in the center of the monument. Even at the time, that was considered just a little too morbid to move ahead. So for many, many years, it was actually the center of the monument was empty. And the statue of Abraham Lincoln wasn't added until 1946. And it's actually a replica of the statue of Lincoln in Lincoln Park in Chicago, although I think it's like a 1/4 scale replica. So anyways, Cambridge Common has all sorts of complications. We're going to move across the street from the Soldiers' Monument to 0 Garden Street. And we have, I think, 2 more stops after this, so we're getting close to the end. This is Christ Church. It was built in 1760, designed by Peter Harrison. And it's a fabulous church. It's worth noting that this was the Anglican church that was built in Cambridge. So it was the church gone to by the Tories. As I mentioned, the Tories weren't necessarily loved by their Puritan neighbors. This was considered a very ornate church when it was built. Compared to a Puritan meeting house, it seemed much fancier than what they were used to. The first pastor of the house was a man named East Apthorpe, who was also not particularly well liked. His house was referred to as the bishop's palace because it was considered far too ornate for a man of God. But the reason that we're actually stopping at Christ Church is because of a bullet hole inside of Christ Church. So during the American Revolution, this church suffered quite a bit of neglect and misuse. It was briefly sort of resurrected and put back together relatively rapidly in late 1775 when Martha Washington made it known that she wanted to have to celebrate her New Year's Eve service inside this church. So it was quickly put back together, but then again fell into disrepair. It is directly across the street from the Cambridge Common, where the Continental Army was encamped. And at the time that the Continental Army was encamped on the Cambridge Common, the route to Boston was much more laborious than it is today. There were no direct bridges across from Cambridgeport or East Cambridge. So to travel on foot to Boston, you would have crossed what today is the Lars Anderson Bridge, and traveled essentially into Alston, up through the Great Neck, through Roxbury and to the Great Neck, and then into downtown Boston. So you're talking, 8 miles or so to get into Boston. So this is part of why it made sense for the Continental Army to be encamped in Cambridge while Boston was the center of the British Army, because the two were actually physically much more separated than they are today. So this brings us back to the bullet hole. And the plaque says, during the Revolutionary War, Christ Church was marred by a number of bullet holes, such as the one here. No one is certain which side of the contending forces fired this particular shot. While it is true that no one is absolutely sure which side fired this particular shot, it is known that this was an Anglican church in a Puritan town that was basically next door to where the Continental Army was encamped. And I think there were no battles fought in Cambridge. So I find it highly, highly unlikely that the British military snuck into Cambridge in the middle of the night and took a pot shot at a church. So I think there's no doubt who fired the shot. I think, of course, it was the Continental Army. Why would it be anyone other than the Continental Army who did this? But I do appreciate that Christ Church has given everyone the benefit of the doubt, and it casting no blame on anyone. It could have been either side that fired the shot, although I think that may be slightly more optimistic than it should be. So as I mentioned, before the West Boston Bridge was built, there was a much more laborious route into Boston. This is the old milestone. It on this side says that Boston is 8 miles. And that was about the distance that it took if you had to essentially cross into Alston and then go up through the Great Neck into downtown Boston, which is a relatively long trip. So this marker is inside the gates of the old burial ground in Cambridge, but that wasn't where it originally was. It was actually lost for many years, and in the 1980s, when they were doing the extension of the Red Line, they dug up the streets, they found the marker, they put it inside the fence of the old burial ground for safekeeping, and it's been there ever since. So what's funny about this marker is that if you look at this side, Boston is 8 miles. But if you look at the other side, it says Boston is 2¼ miles. And so what happened was the West Boston Bridge got built. The West Boston Bridge opened in 1793. And so people thought, well, we have a perfectly good mile marker. Why would we get a new stone? We'll just pick this one up, turn it around, carve the other side, put it back into place, and go on from there. So it's a rock that, depending on which side you look at, has wildly different distances to Boston. So coming to our final stop, and I think that we are still just barely under 1 hour. We have the statue of John Harvard. And people who have toured in Cambridge will certainly know that the statue of John Harvard is known for not being very factual. The statue of John Harvard is occasionally referred to as the statue of three lies, but I'd like to complicate the story slightly more. The three lies. The statue was designed by Daniel Chester French. It was unveiled on October 15th of 1884, and on it was inscribed, John Harvard, founder, 1638. The three lies are that none of that is true. There are no images of John Harvard. So Daniel Chester French paid a student at Harvard to model in period clothing and sculpted it after him. John Harvard did not found Harvard. Harvard was founded by the Massachusetts Bay Colony, and John Harvard, when he died, left land, some money, and a collection of books to the school. They were so grateful for this donation that they renamed the college for him. And Harvard wasn't founded in 1638. Harvard was founded in 1636 and was originally called Newtown College, and it was renamed in 1638 when John Harvard made his donation. So all of that is wrong. But then I'd like to sort of move on to a couple things that are less known about the statue. This is definitely getting into the weeds and is a little nerdy. But if you go to the side of the statue of John Harvard and you look at the Veritas symbol, you'll notice that unlike all of the other Veritas symbols that you'll see generally throughout Harvard, the bottom book in the center is face down. So this was this was done as part of a movement in the late 19th century where people believed that a student's education wasn't complete until he got out and traveled. So for a brief period of time, there was the use of this version of the Veritas symbol with the middle book face down or the bottom book face down. It's just worth noting that. And then the other thing that's worth noting is the toe. When coronavirus is over and everyone goes back to being tourists and traveling, if you walk through Harvard Yard on a sunny afternoon in any of the warm months in Cambridge, you will almost certainly see a crowd of people taking pictures in front of the statue of John Harvard. Many of them will have themselves taking pictures of themselves rubbing the toe of John Harvard, and it's believed that it's good luck to rub the toe of John Harvard. So as Sarah mentioned in her introduction, I actually started working in public history, giving walking tours of Cambridge when I was 13. Back in that time, the toe didn't shine and no one rubbed it. So this story of it being good luck to rub the toe of John Harvard is not like this ancient myth that goes back for a long time. It was actually just started by a tour guide in Harvard Square who just wanted a gimmick. So there is some person who exists in the universe today who can say that he is responsible, he or she is responsible for people rubbing the toe of John Harvard. I find that somewhat amusing, and it's kind of silly that you just see thousands, tens of thousands of adoring people rubbing the toe of John Harvard, and yet it was just a gimmick from a tour guide probably in the late 90s or early aughts that came up with this idea. The other thing, which is the final thing that I'll leave you with, is that there is also another tradition which is less well known about the statue of John Harvard, which is among some undergraduates at Harvard, some of the more rowdy undergraduates. There is a tradition at the end of their freshman year of climbing on top of the statue of John Harvard and urinating on it. I would say that there's something to be said for the relationship between Harvard and the adoring crowds that come to visit. That while people are coming and rubbing the toe, they're not always entirely sure of what they're rubbing or what they're getting. So on that relatively tasteless last note, and see if people have any questions for me, and if they would like to pose them.
So we had one question come in from Andrea, and she just wanted to know, what does the book spine facing out have to do with travel on the statue of John Harvard?
Oh, it was just meant to indicate that a student's education wasn't complete until they put the books down and traveled abroad. So the idea was that you put your book down and moved on.
Another question. So by your estimation, why aren't these incorrect, why isn't this incorrect information or these markers, why aren't they being corrected in any way?
I mean, I think certainly starting with something like the Leif-Erikson marker, that story is a part of the history of Cambridge, and it's actually a really fascinating piece of the history of Cambridge. Other things like people's mimic houses, you know, you're not going to evict someone and take their house and tear it down because it's a replica of someone else's house. So I think that they're just sort of quizzical little things that actually make most of these stories just are their own stories in and of themselves and are interesting and fun little pieces of facts as well.
And another question, thanks so much for this excellent presentation. Could you speak more on why the Longfellow Memorial was constructed and obstructing the view of the Charles? I found that really amusing.
So that I actually don't know off the top of my head. So I didn't, of all the things I looked up, that was one that I forgot to look up. But that person can pass on their name. I would be happy to look it up and send the information on. And you're welcome to visit the actual bust of Longfellow, which is just outside the Cambridge Room in the Cambridge Public Library's main branch next to the high school.
And there was just a couple requests to clarify where the Leif-Erikson marker was.
So the Leif-Erikson marker is essentially behind Mount Auburn Hospital. So if you are walking along Memorial Drive and you walk essentially to the end of Memorial Drive where it flows into Fresh Pond Parkway and there's this sort of crazy busy intersection. If you are on the side of the street further from the river, so there's Memorial Drive, then there's the pathway, then there's the river. So you're on the side closer to Mount Auburn Hospital, and you keep walking along that, the road will curve up towards Fresh Pond Parkway, and it's essentially right at the center of the curve.
And another question, do you know what year the church plaque was placed? Do you think that they feared possibly disparaging Washington and his men for shooting at a church?
I have no idea when the plaque was placed, but I think that it was probably in the 20th century. I think Washington was safely gone. And looking at the oxidation on it, I don't think it has lasted. It would have lasted, you know, for centuries. I think that it probably is a relatively recent plaque, although it may have replaced a plaque that said the same thing.
Okay. And there was also just a question, which I think other people might be interested to know. Is there a published list of all Boston historical markers somewhere?
I don't know that there is.
Project for somebody out there in the
yeah, and this actually comes up somewhat frequently in Cambridge. There's hundreds and hundreds of commemorative like squares and things where, you know, you'll be walking down the street and you'll see that it says, you know, Bob Smith Square. There's actually no record in Cambridge of what all those markers mean. In theory, at some point, there was a vote in the city council to place that there, but it's never been compiled into a single list. So that's one example of things where there just isn't a complete list. But within, and again, I'm more familiar with Cambridge, but in Cambridge, there's like multiple waves of historic plaques that are placed. And all of these have their own sort of ramifications. So the Cambridge Historical Commission has a list of the types of plaques and where most of them are on their website. They do list where all of their blue ovals are, which is reasonable because they place them. But there's also markers that went up in the 1930s to commemorate the anniversary of the founding of Cambridge. There are many markers that went up for different things during the 1970s around the bicentennial. There are actually centennial markers in some places. And there's also things like the African American Heritage Trail markers and Women's History Trail markers. The same is true in Boston, that there is multiple generations of markers, and some of them are sort of hard to keep track of.
Speaking of markers, does the Cambridge Historical Commission care that the blue oval marker exists?
I don't think so. I think that they're perfectly fine with it. And I think it's, as far as I know, it's perfectly historically accurate, and more power to them. So I just find it kind of funny that there's a fake historical commission marker.
Well, we have a lot of other questions, but I think we may be a little short on time at the moment. Thank you everyone for joining us. We hope you enjoyed this program. If you would like to check out some of our upcoming virtual programs, you can do so at our online calendar at masshist.org/calendar. Also, if you feel so inclined, we are accepting donations during this time, masshist.org/support. Thank you very much and enjoy the beautiful evening.